Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. In today's edition, we have to go back to Doorsdorf-Vlaanderen and talk about the repercussions that we're going to see later in the season here in 2024. We saw Wout van Aert go down hard. We saw him sliding over to the side of the road and then falling back on his back there until some help arrived. We saw his jersey all ripped up and we saw him taken out in the ambulance. Now the next day we start seeing some of the press that's put out from Visma talking about how his collarbone break was a successful surgery. Now we saw he had some broken ribs and a sternum, but we don't know exactly the extent of the break there. But when we look at the article and we see Visma say that the Giro is still a possibility or is still in doubt. You look at the article and they're not saying whether if he's going to make the Giro or is not going to make the Giro, which tells me that the sternum and the ribs are fractures and not complete breaks. Now in 2014, after I won the Vuelta a España, I told you guys yesterday on the butterfly effect that the next season while riding with Lampre, I had gotten hit in the tunnel from a car. I had 4 fractured spiral fractures that had crushed in on the ribs. So they were complete breaks of 4 ribs going in that had punctured my lungs. I still made the Tour de France. That's why I told you guys yesterday on the butterfly effect during Doorsdorf-Vlaanderen, the big guy, Wout van Aert, has got to be focusing on the Tour de France. When you look at the article, though, today, as I said earlier, Visma still is not taking Wout off of the Giro list. So that tells me the other fractures of the ribs and the sternum, taking an educated guess here, says that they're fractures and not complete breaks, and they plated his collarbone. Now, if you plate the collarbone, he can be back and training the next day. I mean, it's crazy how fast when the doctors plate the collarbone, which they said it's already been plated. It was a successful surgery, which means that Wout could be back on the bike in 1 day, 2 days on the trainer, no problem. 5 days, I've seen athletes racing big time events after having their collarbone plated when they're trying to make Tour de France's and other big sporting events. It's happened many times. So if you plate the collarbone, that will heal it fast and that will get you back on the bike. He has 37 days to get ready for the Giro. Now that's cutting it tight if he had complete breaks in the ribs or the sternum was a complete break. He's not making the Giro. There's no doubt about that. I've broken my ribs many, many times. It's almost a yearly occurrence. And sometimes if I missed a year, the next year I made it up with having 3 breaks of the ribs throughout the season. So fractures of the ribs, you can race with. It's uncomfortable. Whether or not if you can be 100% on form, that's a whole other deal. But remember, Wout has come from altitude. He has arrived at yesterday's Doorsdorf-Vlaanderen as his second race after altitude, which means his form should be exceptionally good. It looked exceptionally good when just before that crash at 67 kilometers to go in yesterday's race. So if he's back on his bike and training right away, and if the sternum and the ribs were just fractures, he could still make the Giro. I don't doubt that at all. But if they're anything more than fractures, when we're talking about the ribs, he's not making the Giro. There's no doubt about that. We'll see him at the Tour de France. Now, Mads Pedersen, he's got to be the next big favorite that's being affected here going into the Tour of Flanders from the crash at 67K to go. The Trek rider says that he's going to do absolutely everything he can to make Tour of Flanders. So that means that the crash was rough on him. He has a little bit of doubt on how he's feeling the next day when he's getting on his bike or the next day when he's sitting on his Chesterfield. I'm sure more likely that than his bike. But he's hoping to make the Tour of Flanders. That means the crash didn't go as bad for him as it did for Wout van Aert. The problem is for Mads. Let's say he makes the Tour of Flanders. He's there. He's a little beat up, so he's lost a percentage. He was already 1%, maybe 2% behind Mathieu van der Poel's fitness. I know he won there at Ghent with Mathieu van der Poel pulling like crazy for 20 kilometers. But I don't know if Mads can win against Mathieu van der Poel when now we're going to Tour of Flanders. There's going to be a lot more bergs. We're going to have the Paterberg come with only like 15, 17 kilometers before the finish of the race. There's not going to be a 30, 35 kilometer flat section where, of course, Mads has more time to recover after the massive accelerations from Mathieu van der Poel that we're going to see at Tour of Flanders from a guy who didn't crash at Doorsdorf-Vlaanderen. So Mads Pedersen, if he lost 1%, and I already think he's 1, maybe 2% behind Mathieu van der Poel in terms of fitness anyways, the race is going to be 20 kilometers longer than Ghent. It's going to be a tall order for Mads Pedersen to get in there and dice it up with Mathieu van der Poel. Other things to look at. Alex Kirsch went down, broke his hand in the crash. He's Trek. We look at the other teammate, Jasper Stuyvens. He went down. He broke his collarbone. The classic seasons are done and over. And in his social post, he said, the Hella North arrived early. He's going to see you guys next year at the Classic. So we know he's not going to Flanders. And we know Alex Kirsch isn't. The problem for Trek, when you take those two riders out and you add in the complications of the crash to Mads Pedersen, they've just weakened their team in half. When I look at the Tour of Flanders roster, I see there that as Tom Squinge is really the only other climber, they're getting ready to start the Tour of Flanders, that could go deep in the Tour of Flanders and get over the bergs and be there for Mads Pedersen to help him out with all of the attacks that are going to come from Mathieu van der Poel and a bunch of other riders now that they smell the blood in the water, right? Because along with those three Trek riders, when we started looking at Biniam Girmay, his team director Wiesbeck said that he's 50-50 for starting Tour of Flanders. And of course, Biniam Girmay, he had his teammate Lawrence Rex go down in a crash maybe 500 meters before his crash with Wout van Aert and the other Trek riders. So massive repercussions there from the crash with 67 kilometers to go on yesterday's Dwars-Door-Vlaanderen. But Trek still have some hope with Mads going into Flanders. Biniam Girmay still has some hope of making Tour of Flanders, so that'll be interesting. But the whole chemistry in the race has just been affected in every detail you can possibly imagine when we start getting into Tour of Flanders. And Mathieu van der Poel is going to have all kinds of eyes focused on his Alpecin-Deceuninck team. And when we look at Alpecin-Deceuninck proper, I look down at that list. Jasper Philipsen is a sprinter. He has gotten over the climbs when we look at Milan-San Remo because he won there. But when we get into Tour of Flanders, we're talking about almost 20 climbs all coming in the deep second half of that race. And it's going to finish, like I said, with the Patersburg. I don't know if Jasper Philipsen can get over these climbs. And when we look at yesterday's Dwars-Door-Vlaanderen, Jasper Philipsen was in that field and coming up with that group of 25 in the third group. And he couldn't get on the front and chase when it was Søren Kragh Andersen on the front. Jasper Philipsen really needed to get on the front right away. That's the same point in time when we saw Michael Matthews on the front. That tells me that he didn't have the form first to follow the move there of Jorgensen when he started attacking on the Canaryberg. And it tells me he didn't have the form afterwards where he could risk getting on the front with Søren Kragh Andersen, his teammate, along with Michael Matthews and a few other riders that were chasing about 45 seconds behind that group of five being led by Visma Lease Bike. So that means when I'm looking at Flanders, I don't think Jasper Philipsen's a guy that's going to be able to help Mathieu van der Poel deep into the Tour of Flanders. Will he be there with 225 kilometers to go? Hopefully he makes it that far, or Mathieu van der Poel is going to be in big trouble. Because you look at the next list of riders there for Alpecin-Deceuninck, it's kind of lacking in strength in terms of the deep guys that can climb deep into the Tour of Flanders. I don't see it. I only see Søren Kragh Andersen, who was actually quite magnificent in yesterday's Dwars-Door-Vlaanderen, riding the front with that group of 25 and holding the five guys up front to a sizable distance. Either way, Tour of Flanders, massive changes. There's going to be tons of reasons to tune in early at the Tour of Flanders because the other riders and the other teams are already changing their strategy right now big time. And if I was UAE Team Emirates, I might change my strategy and bring Tadej Pogačar out of the altitude. We know he's on form. Bring him in the Tour of Flanders because he doesn't have Wout van Aert to deal with. Mads Pedersen's a little bit weaker. Trek, for sure, as a team's weaker. So they're not going to be there deep into the race to be able to chase Mathieu van der Poel and a Tadej Pogačar. But of course, we know Tadej Pogačar's got the Giro on the Tour, so that's not going to happen. It'd be my wish to see it, though. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'll see you guys on the next edition of Beyond the Coverage real soon.